are billions of people in the world who speak more than one language, but the way we think, well, that's a whole other story. Turns out speaking multiple languages doesn't just mean you have a knack for languages. It also means you have two or more ways of seeing the world. Now, when I say we only use one language at a time, I don't mean like sometimes you speak English and sometimes you speak French. Instead, when any one of us is thinking about anything, we're using what's called a language module. And this language module is either using one language or the other. So my brain has an English language module and a French language module, but at any given moment, only one of them is active. And actually, scientists don't know exactly how many language modules we can have, or how they work, or even how many there are. But we do know that they don't just process language, they shape how we think. So, bilinguals like me end up having more than one way of thinking. You see, each language comes with its own vocabulary, its own ways of describing the world, and when you speak that language, it basically programs your brain to think in that particular way. A lot of bilinguals, including me, will actively choose one language over the other when we're thinking about something. Like if I'm thinking about what to cook tonight, I might start running through recipes in French, even though I could just as easily run through recipes in English. But once I've decided on a recipe and I'm chopping vegetables, I might start thinking in English because that's the language I use most often while I'm cooking. But here's the interesting thing. The way I think about food changes depending on which language I'm using. In French, I tend to think about food in much more precise terms. Maybe it's because French cuisine is just so famous, or maybe it's because French has more words for different kinds of foods. But regardless, in French, I'll be thinking things like, okay, I need some zucchini and yellow squash, some onions, a nice cut of lamb, and some fresh thyme. In English, my thoughts are much more generic. Okay, I need some veggies, some onions, some meat, and some herbs. See, more precise versus more generic. And these aren't just different ways of expressing the same thought. They really are different thoughts. The French thought about food has more detail. The English thought has more breadth. What's going on here is that the language module you're using, whether it's English or French or whatever, activates other parts of your brain, two parts that are responsible for processing specific kinds of information. When I was thinking about food in French, not only was my French language module active, but so was my visual spatial module, which is why I was thinking about the precise ingredients that would go into the dish. When I switched to thinking about the same thing in English, I wasn't activating my language module. I was activating my socio-semantic module, which is why my thoughts were more generic. And this isn't just true for thoughts about food. Every time you use a different language, you're activating a different set of brain modules. And every time you activate a different brain module, you're thinking differently. Which brings us to the famous bilingual advantage. Bilinguals like me tend to be better at switching between different ways of thinking than monolinguals. Let me explain. Back in 2008, researchers gave a bunch of monolingual and bilingual kids a test that measured their executive functioning, basically their ability to switch between different ways of thinking. In this test, kids were shown a bunch of cards with different colors and symbols and told that they needed to sort the cards into different piles based on whatever rule the researcher told them. So the researcher might tell them to put all the red cards in one pile, or they might tell them to put all the triangles in one pile and all the blue cards in another pile, And then once the kids had finished sorting the cards according to one rule, the researcher would change the rules and they had to sort the cards in a different way. The bilingual kids were way better at this than the monolingual kids, especially when the categories for sorting were based on both color and shape. Now, the researchers didn't stop there. They also recruited some adults who were bilingual and some who were monolingual, and they did the same experiment. And guess what? The bilingual adults were better at switching between different ways of thinking than the monolingual adults. But here's the kicker. The bilingual advantage disappeared when the participants weren't actually switching between two different languages. So, for example, if the bilinguals were sorting cards based on size instead of color and shape, they weren't outperforming the monolinguals anymore. So, bilingualism doesn't give you some kind of general cognitive superpower. It just gives you a superpower at switching between different ways of thinking, which is something bilinguals do all the time. You see, when bilinguals are choosing which language to use, we're constantly switching between our different language modules. And that, in turn, switches on different parts of the brain. And over time, that practice makes it easier to switch between different ways of thinking. This is why a lot of bilinguals excel at creative endeavors like art, music, and writing. Research shows that bilinguals tend to be more creative than monolinguals, and that's because being bilingual means you're flexing your brain's executive function muscles all the time. It's not just the bilingual advantage either. Bilingual brains are also wired to be more flexible. Let me explain. Speaking more than one language means you have more than one way of understanding words. You see, words are arbitrary. They're just sounds that we agree mean something. Like, why is the word for bread in English not pain? Why is the word for mother in French not mirror? Words are arbitrary. So bilinguals have to work harder to figure out the meaning of words than monolinguals, because they can't rely on the context as much. For example, if someone says, "I went to the lake and let the dog off its leash," we immediately understand that leash refers to the thing that keeps the dog from running away. But if I said to a monolingual English speaker, "J eat o lac, etj less lachen sans sa less," they wouldn't necessarily know that less meant leash. They'd have to infer it from the context. Similarly, if someone tells me Sarah is a real piece of work, I immediately know that piece doesn't refer to something physical. It refers to a type of person. But if I said that to a monolingual English speaker, they'd have to infer the meaning of peace from the context. When you're a bilingual, you encounter this problem all the time, which forces you to develop strategies to figure out the meaning of words quickly. One strategy bilinguals often use is to think of synonyms in their other language. So, if someone says Sarah is a real piece of work,
I might think of the German word SHA colaboradores, and because I already know what SHA colaboradores means, I can figure out that piece of work means a certain type of person.
that little mental detour allows me to think of words and concepts more flexibly than a monolingual speaker would. And that flexibility means that bilinguals are better at using words and concepts in novel combinations. Take this sentence, for example. I have a bike in the fridge. If you're a monolingual speaker, you probably immediately understand this sentence literally. A bike is in the fridge. But if you're bilingual, you might be able to parse the sentence in two different ways. You might think of it literally, a bike is in the fridge, or you might think of it metaphorically. The bike represents something else, and the fridge represents something else. And that flexibility can lead to all sorts of creative endeavors, like metaphors. Metaphors are basically just comparisons between two things that aren't alike in any obvious way. But when you think of a bike as a fridge, or vice versa, it helps you express complex ideas in new ways. In fact, research shows that bilinguals come up with more creative metaphors than monolinguals. So because bilinguals routinely switch between different ways of thinking, we're better at using words and concepts in novel combinations. This is why knowing more than one language doesn't just make you better at translating, it makes you better at thinking. Every language is a different way of seeing the world, a different way of thinking. And the more ways of seeing the world you have, the better you are at navigating it. Thanks for watching this episode. We've made thousands of educational videos over the years, and we've been able to offer them for free because of our patrons. So to all of our patrons, thank you for what you do to make this happen. If you're not a patron but you want to learn more about what that means, you can go to our support page.